Hey everyone, I thought about taking a break from, it's another history video, but a break from the Roman Republic. In fact, I'm going way into the future. And this one's more, I guess, military, nautical themed. I thought about just a idea floating out there. I always love like naval history and some of the stuff around ships and the origins of them. So I kind of want to go through like how our ship designated. Specifically, I'm really going more stop around World War II, but what people think of the modern classical ship names, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, how they got their names, where the designations come from, the different types, and the history around that. So kind of go maybe talk a little bit about sea history. A lot of it revolves around Europe and how they define stuff out of Europe, even though the U.S. and Japan and other navies, China and stuff copied the descriptions. A lot of it is, keep in mind as we go through this, a lot of it's taught off Europe, and some of it actually goes back further than you would think. And of course, the one I wanted to start with is the battleship, and a ship that's not really in service anymore in the modern era, partly due to it became obsolete. Really, it started coming obsolete even during World War II, but it still had functions in the war, depending on where it was at. But where that name comes from actually refers to goes all the way back to the 16 and 1700s, 17th, 18th century, what I'd say. As you started developing more advanced, Europe started developing more advanced naval ships. They started building multi-deck guns, and they call them 42 gunner, 56 gunner, fourth rate, fifth rate, and they call them ships of the line or ships of the battle line. And so these ships were mainly designed where they would sit in Europe. They rarely went maybe to the Caribbean sometimes or fought in the New World, but they rarely moved out of the Europe region. So they were primarily in there. Of course, the British had the biggest fleet, especially after that. I think they defeated the Dutch a few times in the 1600s, and a little period the Dutch had naval supremacy, and Spain did for a little bit as well. Spain and France would have big navies throughout the period as well that theoretically could have challenged England, but they called them ships of the line or ships of the battle line, and they usually stayed in what's called home waters, which is near the mother country. Mediterranean, North Atlantic, Baltic, that area. Sometimes they would slip into the Caribbean. And the reason I'm telling you where they're limited and stuff is because it kind of goes into how cruisers gets their name, which I'll go to that in a minute. But so sorry, my dog's trying to come see me right now. So you had the battleships, and they start as they went along. That's where the kind of the name comes from. Ships of the battle line eventually became battleships, and they were constantly in arms race in the late 19th century, late 1800s, as they started steel plating warships, and they came up with the turret guns, which the dreadnought was really the first to truly do that. They had the dreadnought, the British came up with it, could fire long distance, so you no longer had to get within sight of the other opposing ship to shoot at it, and it outpaced every what they call the pre-dreadnought battleships after that. Although in World War One, you still had a significant number of pre-dreadnought battleships, and they were very effective if they can get close. But a dreadnought could shoot it from a distance. But that's where the term battleships, and they were the central part of the Navy. They were kind of like these. You rated your Navy based on how many battleships you had. Man of wars was the old man of wars or ships on the line was the old name for it. But it was kind of an evolution of moving away from the multi gun, sometimes 120 gun ships of the wooden sail era into the more modern battleship. So they'd be your central design, surely for combat. They're usually the most armored ships you had and had the most gunnery. So they'd have the long distance guns and armory. Of course, they got limited under the Washington Treaty in the 1920s, going into World War II. You had a limited number of battleships every Navy could have, and some people try to get around it in different ways, and I'll kind of explain that as I go more into cruisers, and specifically battle cruisers, which would be kind of like the next level I'd go down to. So that's kind of where battleships come from. They're ships of the battle line. They're the supreme warship of that time, and they're really the kind of the first to evolve. You would call all the ships battleships starting out. You'd have navies or in the late 1800s. There was no destroyers or cruisers yet, and I'll get to a minute what cruisers are. You kind of had them come along as well, but they had a different designation and function. And speaking of that, let's go on to cruisers. So you had early on you had two types of cruisers they started with. They were called protected cruiser and an armored cruiser. And the evolution of the cruiser name actually dates back to the 1700s. and it would typically be a frigate or you call a fourth or fifth rate ship of the line was usually designated a frigate, and they would be one. All it would be was a term for a ship put on a special mission, usually to leave home waters and go overseas, like to the Pacific or Indian Ocean or something like that. They were out cruising. That was the term. So they would designate them in cruisers or cruiser fleets, so they could go out and do missions. And I'm talking about this is the age of sail, and so that's current. So what became the frigate, the fourth, fifth rate ship of the line classes, eventually evolved the term cruisers. Was as modern navy started coming along, you would have lighter ships you would build for particular purposes, more for selling out to the colonial period. Sorry, the dog's bothering me. Going out on these colonial to defend your colonies or go on different various task force. Initially, one of the primary thoughts behind them was commerce raiding. They could go overseas and interject trade, and then you'd have to build ships that could defend against trade interdiction. One of the interesting notes where trade interdiction really took on a lot of attention is actually the American Revolution. And it's not really, I watched a special one time about it. It's not really talked a whole lot about how much piracy and trade interdiction impacted the Royal Navy during the American Revolution, and was primarily the reason that you had late in the war a lot of the Parliament, a lot of the common House of Commons had merchants who had been suffering drastically from piracy during the American Revolution. Sometimes it wasn't even Americans, because Americans, what they did, they gave a letter of marque, which means you can go raid British shipping and use U.S. ports for a port of call. And throughout naval history, that's where privateers and all that stuff came from. Is one of the greatest challenge for pirates, or if you're going to engage in piracy, is having a friendly port to visit. And basically, every U.S. port that's under American control, not British control, became places where pirates who attacked British shipping could visit. So you had pirates from Ireland, the Caribbean, Scotland. Anybody had a beef against the British Navy, attacking them, and then coming to U.S. ports to trade and sell all their products and make money. And that just massively damaged British shipping. And after the war, the whole British Royal Navy strategy changed, and it really helped them later in the Napoleonic Wars. And they started coming up with fast cruising frigate classes, the whole purpose of going out to sea and stopping commerce raiders, because the American had engaged that. So these pirate hunters, they had started a little bit before the American Revolution, but they never had designated in a full naval strategy. So cruisers became very important on defending the high seas, notably your merchant fleets. So they're away from home waters. They're out in the deep Atlantic. They're out in the Pacific or the Indian Oceans or South Atlantic, and they're defending trade. They're defending convoys. Or if you're opposing navy, they could be raiders as well. So those are two main early functions of cruisers. They'll have other functions as other ships are invented. The protected really refers to a metal plating they put around the ship rim. Uh, Protected cruisers would kind of go away because they all ships after that would start having what you would have the armored cruisers have. But they were also designed a little bit different. Armored cruisers are designed better to engage with battleships. Protected weren't. Protected would eventually evolve in what we call light cruisers. Armored cruisers would evolve into what we call heavy cruisers. You had a third class, the British started, and then Germans followed suit, and other navies made, called battle cruisers. And battle cruisers were basically battleships with lighter armor that focused on speed. And the British original reason for creating a battle cruiser was to have a fast, powerful ship to hunt cruisers. It was designed to hunt down and destroy German cruisers or any opposing navy's cruisers that could harm British convoys. And so that was kind of the focus of battle cruisers, although they sometimes took on other roles. And Germans actually designed their battle cruisers to kind of be subs for battleships, because they didn't have the same number of battleships as the British, but they can make battle cruisers cheaper and quicker. So you could sub them into the battle line as needed. And British battle cruisers came versatile in that way as well. But you would have, that was kind of the purpose. They were kind of faster battleships, more designed to go on cruises, as you call it, leave the home waters and go engage and stuff. So they would actually become important both, not just in World War One, but World War Two. You had two of the ships that sank the most mercantile fleets in World War Two. Number of ships were Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, two German battle cruisers, who sailed 1942 to 44. I think they even sank a British aircraft carrier at one point, and they were probably the most effective surface ships of Germany had. Far better than the Tirpitz and Bismarck, who get a lot more attention, but they were probably the most effective surface ships the Germans had during World War II. So you had the battle cruiser, and you got the heavy cruiser and light cruiser. And heavy and light cruiser take on a new role as you get towards the and battle cruisers as well towards the Versailles Treaty, because I'm not Versailles Treaty, the Washington Treaty, because battle cruisers can sometimes fall. Like there was a British battle cruiser class called the G5, which technically didn't classify as a battleship, but could somewhat be competitive with a battleship, and they built some of them. I think the Renown and Repulse were two examples of that. They would build them during the interwar period, and other navies kind of engaged in it. And you had another kind of ship that was a little bit an upgrade version of heavy cruiser. They only had this ship class. There's only 3 ships that ever fit this class. They called them pocket battleships, and they were some German heavy cruisers, the Graf Spee. There's 2 other ones, Deutschland, and one other one. They were basically very fast cruisers that had the guns, uh, not quite the guns of a battleship, but very close. They could effectively sink heavy cruisers and light cruisers, but they probably wouldn't be able to sink a battle cruiser or a battleship. So they were designed specifically for commerce raiding to attack the British shipping, and 3 of them were built in the 1930s. The Graf Spee was famously sank at the very beginning of the war off the coast of Argentina and Uruguay by 3 British heavy cruisers who masked that they fleet was bigger than what they were, and the ship ended up scuttling. I think because they couldn't stay in Montevideo harbor in Uruguay, and they came out and scuttled. And that was the first German ship sunk in World War II. But you had those pocket battleships, which were basically Germany had 3 of them. They were commerce raiders. Light cruisers took on a secondary role due to the invention of another ship called a destroyer, which I'll get to those in a minute. But light cruisers became anti-destroyer ships, and the term protected cruiser kind of took on a new role too This started in World War One, and the fact that battleships could be vulnerable to torpedo boats and destroyers. Destroyers focused on torpedo attacks, and even World War Two, destroyers focused a little bit on torpedo attacks and anti-submarine warfare. Destroyers were very versatile in World War Two, but when I get to them, but light cruisers effectively could be destroyers. They were and defend. So they would actually light cruisers would be placed in fleets with battleships and later on aircraft carriers to defend them against destroyers, along with other destroyers. So that became another designation role. The light cruisers could take the torpedoes, fight against torpedoes, and they could actually launch their own torpedoes as well. And then reconnaissance becomes a focus of cruisers in World War II. So they become versatile as well. So they can go out and spot enemy fleets, report it back so that the main fleet can go and engage. So all these versatile tactics, I think even heavy cruisers could do in coastal bombardment, like battleships. So as you go through, they become the cruisers were very versatile. Destroyers during World War One they weren't that versatile, but World War Two they would. World War One they were basically used as that first wave of torpedoes, hoping to knock out enemy battleships, and then withdrew after. They weren't that effective in the scheme of things, but they were a dangerous threat. Navies had to maintain their own destroyers and cruisers to guard against them. Um, During World War One, they would become more effective as submarine hunters as submarines came along. World War Two, they would be very versatile. They would engage in recon. They could engage in combating, even at times, capital ships. Anti-air, they were plowed around carriers to fire their anti-aircraft guns up to defend them, especially by the U.S. Navy. U.S. Navy would actually have anti-air focus usage of them. Submarine warfare, depth charges, all that stuff was launched on them. And you had Britain even released special ships called corvettes, which were designed totally to battle German U-boats during World War II. A version of destroyer. You had destroyer escorts, which are smaller destroyers as well. You had destroyer leads, which sometimes were borderline light cruisers, which are kind of like a bigger version of a destroyer that could engage better with cruisers. So that took on a variety of functions: recon, light screening, which they could fire torpedoes at capital ships and defend against light ships from opposing navies, anti-submarine warfare, anti-aircraft warfare, variety of stuff that destroyers would do. And they were actually the most built, most common, and most versatile ship in World War II. They were everywhere. Every Navy had them. They were very effective. Heck, they were even used as shore bombardment sometimes. They were used, Germany put troops on them when they invaded Norway on their destroyers. They were used to land troops. They took on a variety of functions, but primarily they became the primary anti-submarine naval escort ship in World War II, or protected capital ships, along with light cruisers. And light cruisers and destroyers kind of took the same role. It just light cruisers could effectively fight destroyers. And of course, corvettes and frigates were smaller ships, more specialized, fighting submarines, recon, just weaker versions of destroyers. But that kind of leads out of the surface ships, other than the aircraft carrier, which the aircraft carrier became the dominant naval ship, especially in the Pacific. It was most effective in the Pacific due to the wide breadth of ocean, during World War II, and really maintains that to today. It's the premier capital ship, and its use is obvious. It's basically a mobile air base, effectively. And when you have an aircraft carrier fleet, its entire fleet, like when the U.S. deploys one, there's 30 other ships with it. So yeah, that's kind of, the aircraft carrier was kind of guarded even back in World War II. You were surrounded with destroyers, cruisers, and they would actually protect it from submarines or with their anti-aircraft guns or from other capital ships. But yeah, carriers became basically the air dominant naval fleet, and took over the role of the battleship as the premier naval ship. They weren't that used that much in World War One. They were still very early, mostly recon, because Air Force was primarily, especially the first few years of war, just recon. So they're very experimental, not very widely used in World War One. But World War Two, they took on a chief role, and some of the most famous aircraft victories or whatever. The earliest one was in Taranto, where the British Navy attacked the Italian Navy in dock and sank or damaged 3 or 4 of their capital ships, crippling the Italian Navy and allowing Britain to get supremacy in the Mediterranean. There was the Swordfest launch from the Ark Royal that damaged the Bismarck's rudder, so it couldn't steer and it was going in a circle, which led to it sinking. Then of course Pearl Harbor, and then Midway, Coral Sea, the Philippine Sea. About every major Pacific engagement was Japanese aircraft carriers versus American aircraft carriers, and at that point it became clear that aircraft carriers had supplanted battleships. Battleships just did not have, even though they had the longest range of any of the surface ships. Aircraft carriers can engage in combat where the ships never even get close inside or even radar range with each other. So it just created that long distance attack beyond what a battleship could ever dream of. And once that was over, once that happened, that became the primary way of fighting at sea. And then the final kind of class everybody knows is a submarine. And submarines really kind of, you had something the Confederates came up with during the Civil War, called the Hunley, that famously sank a Union ship but then disappeared itself. You had some other experiments in both Europe and the U.S. The real, when you think of submarine like we think of today, I think was invented in France. And I know the French Navy came up with the original Pacific design. Even though other navies had submarines, they weren't anything like what you would think of a submarine that could surface and stuff, until the French Navy came along and built one. And then that got copied by the British, the Germans, later the Americans, and about everyone. And everyone started getting submarines. By the time World War One rolled around, about everybody had them, but Germany became the most notorious for how its submarines were used, both in the U-boat, which was the submarine warfare in both World War One and World War Two. Interesting, World War Two, it was a massive part of the Battle of the Atlantic, the submarine campaign. And Germany, so going into, I'd say these are 30s, you had Karl Donitz and Erich Raeder. They were kind of like the two big naval guys in Germany. And Germany had already come up with ideas even before Hitler came along about how to combat the British Navy through convoy warfare, because they knew they couldn't match the Royal Navy ship to ship. And there was this thing eventually they called it Plan Z, but they were trying to decide what would be the future of the German Navy. And Hitler was around by this point. He was the one that was agreeing to it. And it was very ambitious. They wanted to build all these surface ships. Submarines were part of it. They're going to build a lot of them. But Karl Donitz said he needed 200, or I can't remember the number of submarines he needed. If you give that to me by the time we start a war, I could stop British trade. And he only had a fraction of them by the time the war broke out. And they had all this dream about building 6 battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, all these cruisers and stuff. They never quite got there. So it was very ambitious. It never happened. But there's some thought of a big what if is what if they had not built some of the surface ships, or focused as much on that and focused entirely on the submarines, like not built the Bismarck or Tirpitz, but built just submarines on that and started the submarine building. That they later on built a lot of submarines during the war, but if they had been as aggressive pre-war and popped into the war with a lot more submarines, what would have happened to the British? So that's always been a big what if out there, and it's like the surface fleet for Germany was not near as effective as the U-boat during the early phase of the war. Now later on, Britain and the United States both came up with countermeasures to combat it, but early on it was a real threat. An interesting example of submarine warfare going very well was the U.S. in World War II. They actually did ground the Japanese convoy fleet, and it got to where they couldn't even trade anymore with their areas they conquered. Like the most important was the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, because that's what they had oil, and that's what Japan was missing. They needed oil. Oil and rubber came out of there, and Japan started losing so many ships that we basically docked their fleet, and they couldn't function anymore. They couldn't. They were limited on how they could use their navy, which was being sunk heavily. How they could use their air force. Their army, I guess, could still fight. It didn't run on oil, but a lot of their war machine by 1945 was ground to a halt due to not being able to get trade. And the U.S. submarine fleet was just sinking. Any Japanese ship that came out, it was gone. It was fair game. They also sank a lot of Japanese capital ships. I think it was 3 or 4 of the aircraft carriers were sank by submarines. 2 of them at the Battle of Philippine Sea. So some U.S. submarines were very effective in World War II. Actually, more so than probably the U-boats were for Germany, even though the U-boats get all the attention. But that's kind of, if you're ever interested in naval warfare, that's kind of how things go. Of course, submarines and aircraft carriers really took off after World War II. The ability to fight underwater and use air in the sea supplanted the surface ships. And surface ships are really more designed today to be missile attack, anti-air, anti-sub. They're usually supporting one of the 2 of those elements of naval warfare. It's primarily underwater and above water. In the air combat now in the naval sphere. You don't see many ships now with big guns like you did in World War II. That it's kind of obsolete at this point, but that's kind of where we're at. With naval warfare. I thought it was fine. I thought this might be interesting for some people. Maybe a good little break is, why do we call this thing a destroyer? And oh yeah, the term destroyer. I forgot to mention what that came from. That was literally initially they called them torpedo boats. That was the name for a destroyer. They just called them torpedo boats. Then I think it refers to the destroyer's ability to sink a battleship real quickly at the torpedo. It could destroy a destroyer. Kind of like the cruiser term is the going out in missions. Battleship term, ship of the battle line. That's how that's how they get their names. And the light and heavy cruiser designation wasn't really used till after Washington Treaty, and refers to, so there was limitation on the armaments and guns of cruisers. A light cruiser fell totally within the Washington Treaty. You can build as many of those as you want. You could just, fair game. Heavy cruisers did have some limitations, and it's primarily used by the U.S. and British Navy because a lot of the other countries skated around the Washington Treaty, and they would claim they were light cruisers, but they built a lot of non-compliant ships of that class. They were initially, it did work on battleships, but later on, you had Japan building the Musashi and Yamato. That violated the Washington Treaty. Germany never even signed it, but frankly, Germany never had a big enough navy to matter. Italy, later on with Mussolini, started to ignore it. France was compliant. Russia was compliant. U.S. and Britain were compliant, and of course, until war broke out, and then they both built up. And really, it was an attempt. Washington Treaty, the true attempt of it was the British were not economically strong enough to continue a naval buildup like they had leading into World War One, and they mostly feared actually the U.S. Navy, because the U.S. had the economy to build a fleet larger than Britain, which became a realization during World War II when Britain U.S. way outpaced the British Navy. At the beginning of the war, Britain had a bigger navy, but by the 1945, U.S. Navy's three to four times its size easily. And basically, Britain during the war acknowledged it surrendered its control of the sea to the United States, and which is held up to this very day. And you could see kind of how important Navy is. One, there's a doctrine about every major war: the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic War, World War I, World War II. Whoever had control of the sea won the war. Even the Civil War. One of the biggest reasons the Confederacy started falling apart at the end was the Union naval blockade. It was one of the major problems they kept talking about and couldn't handle. Um, Interesting, that war saw a lot of naval aviation too. I got a whole book. I bought it at a antique store about naval history of the Civil War and all the ironclads and stuff that were built by both sides and the different ship upgrades they kept doing. It's interesting. You'd be surprised how much, for a war that you'd think would be mostly on land, how much effort was put in the Navy, especially around the rivers and water arteries that were. It was constant. But yeah, you can see, like, even with Iran and the situation right now, the Gulf of Hormuz, how important Navy can be. It can stop and it can interject trade and shut down economies. And a lot of times, the losers in these wars, Germany in World War One, especially, the Confederacy, Napoleon, their economies get strangled because they can't maintain naval trade anymore, and you start losing access to food, access to markets, access to raw materials. You need to fight wars. So naval supremacy is key and critical in warfare. I mean, Britain stunted most of its rivals in these wars because of its navy, and there was nothing they could do. They couldn't really attack Britain. They couldn't trade globally anymore. They were limited to continental Europe or whatever areas they were conquering, and it wasn't a winning game because eventually, bam. I mean, I talked about the First Punic War, Rome and Carthage. Rome knew to beat Carthage, it had to build a navy. And after it won the First Punic War, it had naval supremacy from there on. So that goes to my back. I call out to my Roman Republic series. But yeah, control of the sea usually means control of the economy, and you gotta have money, you gotta have resources to fight war, especially in the modern era. But thought that'd be interesting to go over these ship classes. I actually have an uncle in the Navy. I may talk to him too. He might be have a follow up video on this if after I talk to him. He may have some ideas. I know the U.S. Navy designates stuff a little differently than how I do, but from a historical perspective, most of their ships fall into those categories. You get a little bit more creative when you get the smaller destroyer classes like frigates or destroyers. There's a little bit more creativity there as well, but primarily they're usually destroyers or small or missile gun boats or something of that nature that are in that torpedo boats in that smaller naval category. But you basically got the destroyer, cruiser, battleship, carrier, sub, are the five that most people know very well. That's it. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I am working on the next Roman Republic one on the Gracchi brothers. It's been very interesting. I'm going to try to not be political, but it sounds a lot like the United States. I'm sorry. Yeah, when you hear what's going on with the Gracchi, but everything around this story, and you start realizing this is when the Republic, it doesn't fall, but all the rules start changing and they start being broken, and it's going to be an interesting one. I'll get into that in a minute. How impactful that period was on the Roman Republic, how it opened the door to a lot of new stuff. But thank you everyone for listening to this, and hope you're enjoying the series. But we also might get back into sports soon and other topics. But I'll talk to everybody later.